And okay, cool. It's showing up. Great.
Yeah, depending on time, Abina, I don't know.
Mute? Should we unmute our machine? Okay, wait. Can someone in the audience say something online?
We can hear you.
Perfect. And we can hear you. Awesome.
All right, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Varun. This is Sumer. And our project was RecyclePi, where we're trying to give old smartphones a new lease on life by replacing them in projects that use the Raspberry Pi. So for a little bit of context, Raspberry Pis are really important in a lot of DIY projects as well as science applications. And some of these applications are things we saw in class, like the octopi, squid, and planktoscope. But they frequently suffer from supply shortages, which can result in high cost or general unavailability. And one thing we didn't mention is they can also be a little bit computationally slow, and people end up using more expensive devices. And so we also noticed there's a problem that a lot of old smartphones are frequently discarded and they end up as e-waste in landfills. And so we thought maybe we could have a solution here where we're going to use old, cheaply available smartphones as a replacement to the Raspberry Pi in many of these important projects. And so we were looking at some of the risks and benefits. There's almost an infinite supply of smartphones because there's 1.5 billion manufactured annually. They have diminishing costs and they have increasing performance over time. They're packed with sensors like a microphone, display, those types of things. They're super resilient. A lot of them are waterproof, but there's no addressable serial ports, so they don't have as much customization as a Raspberry Pi. And also they're closed source. So manufacturers don't give you a really easy way to interface with the software and hardware. And so we wanted to answer two main questions. One of them was a software question, which was, can smartphones serve as cheap compute and can they efficiently run these complex image processing and segmentation algorithms? And then the second is, what are the issues that are preventing the use of smartphones to control external hardware modules such as cameras, motors, and other things like that? And we decided to focus our space a little bit by only replacing the Raspberry Pi in the Octopi. So that would be a good proof of concept.
Okay, so let's start off kind of with the first task, which is software benchmarking, specifically looking at some of the code that Octopi runs on smartphones. So when considering devices, we basically realized that in order to satisfy this requirement of like both software and hardware control, we had to look at Androids. So we wanted to benchmark some Android devices against other accessible devices, including the MacBook Pro, which has that M1 Pro chip, an iPhone 14 Pro, Google Pixel 4 and 3, which much cheaper as some of the older ones that we found online, a Raspberry Pi 3B, and then an NVIDIA Jetson, which is used in the Octopi paper, but not tested. And also a generic gaming laptop, which when we were talking to Hong Chuan in the lab, he had mentioned that in the field, due to some issues with like Raspberry Pi resiliency and this sort of thing, and the Jetson, they ultimately are currently using these gaming laptops. And so that was one other interesting thing, that as we were even finagling with the Pi and this sort of thing, we noticed it would reboot or like shut down very easily just based on jostles, which obviously wasn't the case with the smartphones, which was a nice added plus. And yeah, so just emphasizing that Androids are kind of our target devices here. And so just a little overview about what the Octopi machine actually runs. So the first task it does is kind of parasite detection on these fluorescent stains, like we talked about in class, to kind of get a sense for how many parasites are actually in a slide, and relies on computationally expensive image processing methods. And then the second task is that the parasite count is useful, but we also kind of need to know like how many red blood cells are in the sample. And so we have to run red blood cell segmentation, which uses deep learning methods such as convolutional neural nets. And this code can also run both on a CPU or GPU. Cool. So our preliminary approach to trying to get this work was just to really lightweight run Python code on the devices using IDEs, but we ran into a lot of issues there with in terms of the limited customization of code that you could run. We also came across this framework called Kivy, which is basically a way that you can deploy Python apps cross-platform, but it was a little too complex for a use case. Could be useful if you want to deploy custom apps later. And then also we tried to just run Python directly on the Android devices via this app called Termux, which essentially allows you to run it in a shell. but there was a lot of installation and compatibility issues that just wouldn't scale to many devices.
So ultimately, our final approach was to try to do some Linux emulation on these Android devices. Um, so what we found out was that these Android smartphones can support full Linux emulation via Termux, which is the app that Sumer was talking about earlier. And so we installed Ubuntu 22.04 on both of the devices, and we were able to install all the necessary Python dependencies we needed. And then with this, we could run a lot of CPU benchmarks. And here's a quick demo of us just like running full Ubuntu on the device. So this is a full desktop Ubuntu running off of a tiny device here. And in terms of like the snappiness of the UI, we actually felt like it was way quicker than the Raspberry Pi. And it's almost at the point now where if all they had was access to one of these devices, they could do most like basic word processing in a desktop environment using one of these devices, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, it's literally like anything that you would get on your Linux desktop, you can have on this phone. One other added note is we don't always have to render the GUI. Like if we don't render it and just use the CLI tools, then its performance is even faster. It's even snappier.
Yeah, and so with this,
Yeah, so we can dive into some of the benchmarking results for the parasite detection. So in this chart, you can kind of see the different devices and how they stacked up. We ran these benchmarks across 5,000 images. And one interesting thing to note is that initial experiments on cell phones were very dependent on external interactions. Like the laptop was pretty stable, but like when I was running things on my iPhone and got like the screen closed, I had to like swipe up and like use Face ID and unlock it. Performance dropped a ton, which makes sense. So the final experiments here, we standardized everything by connecting all the phones to power, turning all like Wi-Fi cellular off, and also kept displays on to prevent sleeping.
but for this proof of concept, these are all just CPU tests.
All CPU tests, right? And so just kind of like we can actually just look in the next chart. So this kind of shows kind of the results and performance here in terms of like average time it takes to process each image. And so we can see here like the Pixel 3, so the top line kind of suffered from a little bit of throttling as like it heated up as we were really hammering the CPU. Whereas the Pixel 4, just one generation later, was pretty stable in addition to being faster. So that was really nice to see because obviously you don't want your device to stop working after getting halfway through a patient's images. And then one other thing to note, which is kind of like a good point to the future, is the iPhone 14 Pro was actually the fastest out of all devices because this is a single core CPU process. So like at the 0th time step early on, it was the fastest. So that bodes well for smartphones going into the future as older smartphones become the current smartphones.
But ultimately, the MacBook did win out just
by a hair.
Just because it doesn't thermal throttle the same way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But of course, compared to the Raspberry Pi, any one of these devices is so much better. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious. And then kind of on the red blood cell segmentation. So this is the one that was using the neural network. So we couldn't get a benchmark to work on the Raspberry Pi in time. And then the iPhone actually had issues, kind of as I was mentioning earlier, in the way that you could just run Python code via an IDE on a phone. The iPhone we couldn't get the installation of PyTorch to run, which is what we use to do the CNNs. But as we can see here, the Pixel 4, 6 seconds compared to the 12.5 seconds that the Pixel 3 took. So that just kind of shows maybe the trends over time of the improving compute.
Cool. Yeah. And so then the second question we mentioned in the beginning was, can we use these smartphones to control hardware that's required by the Octopi device? So we started off with two main attempts or two approaches. The first was a wired approach using a USB on-the-go cable to serial port adapter. And then the second was to use a Node MCU to communicate with the device wirelessly. And ultimately, we were only able to try the wireless approach. Given time constraints, we couldn't actually get the full motor control working, but we were able to like establish the way to communicate between the device and this Node MCU. It's basically a wireless Arduino that costs $4 to buy. Like you can buy a pack of 3 for $7 or $8. And this was enabled by hosting a server on that Node MCU device and then using our smartphone to connect to it through a browser. And so here's a quick demo of us just turning an LED on and off. So Sumer clicks on the phone, it's completely disconnected wirelessly, and the LED turns on. And then if he clicks off, it turns off. And this is all on this like $4 device communicating wirelessly. And ideally, what we would do is build out a full motor control system. We had some schematics for this, but we ultimately didn't have the time to actually try it. And so some of the future work we're looking at is on the software side, interfacing with these devices at a lower level using the GPU and other accelerators. So PyTorch Android might be a good option for this, or Kivi. The second is testing the Node MCU or ESP8266, that Arduino device, its bandwidth, because when we were talking to people in the lab, they were mentioning that these devices like the Octopi and Squid, they often are sending hundreds of megabytes of data over to the like Raspberry Pi or GPU of the gaming laptop. And so we want to make sure that the wireless option could even support that type of bandwidth. And then the last thing is we unfortunately didn't have a chance to attempt stepper motor control, but we want to see if we could do that using this approach. And we did do a lot of work into looking at all the different approaches here. So if anyone's interested, we're happy to talk to you about the software stuff, the hardware stuff, some other approaches that we didn't get to try. And we can also happily take you through all the minutia of how you can get all this stuff working. Finally, we just wanted to thank all the Prakash Lab members who helped us throughout this project, letting us in and out of the lab. We were there until midnight last night, and definitely could not have done that if people weren't there to let us in. So thank you to them for all the help. And yeah, thank you so much to all of you guys for listening. Do you guys have any questions?
That was fantastic. Comments, questions, ideas?
Yeah, I think like one kind of summarization is like, we're definitely very bullish on the ability to use smartphones in these devices. Like I think these initial explorations, although we ran into many issues along the way, like I think the final solutions, especially on the software side that we came to, are pretty promising in terms of like its flexibility, which is very important.
I am just so surprised by that result of iPhone matching a MacBook Pro almost.
Yeah. Well, so I looked into this also after we did the benchmarks, and I'm like, is there something wrong here? But then it turns out that like on a single core, like the A16 Bionic is like very, very optimized. And so obviously like as soon as you start doing anything else on the phone, like performance drops a ton just on the multi-threaded. MacBook blows it out of the water, but it's really good for these sorts of tasks. Obviously, if you were wanting to parallelize your image processing, that wouldn't be the best to do on a single core. But that's where kind of like maybe we could tap into the GPU if we're able to write more customized code on the Androids. The iPhone definitely you won't be able to use the GPU.
Yeah, I guess also on the motor side of the story, there are a couple of for much of the instruments and machines, clearly the cameras and the sensors we are talking to make sure that none of the data is dropped. But on the motor control, I'm not too worried about the bandwidth side of the story. It's a very specific scan, especially if we want to, I think one way to approach this is to take one specific application, which is just on the malaria side of the story. And have, because squids, we do a lot of general purpose things and they change significantly. But both the compute task on Octopi is very well defined, and even the scan is very well defined. Because once the autofocusing is done, we exactly do the exact same scan. What I'm trying to say is there's not that much feedback associated with it, as long as we're not dropping the imaging frames. So on the camera side of the story, are there threads of how to capture that data effectively?
So like, yeah, and the reason why we mentioned the bandwidth was because when we were talking to Hong Chan, he was mentioning that like he thought motor control we would be able to get working decently well, but he thought the hard part would be other sensors on the device. So that's why we mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't looked into it too much. I mean, we do have a web server, so that allows two-directional communication between the Arduino and the phone. But I think the thing that we don't know is how much overhead that web server adds to the Arduino, and also like how quickly it can pull data just on device, how much data can it process before it sends it to the smartphone. And then also we mentioned the bandwidth, like the Wi-Fi bandwidth, because I don't know how well that would work.
I think probably like you'd end up having the Node MCU do the motor control, but then like trying to get some wired connection to the phone and the camera directly.
Yeah, and again, remember one thing that we have not even as yet talked about, but eventually if we go in this direction, We have, of course, explored in the past just directly using cell phone cameras as our sensors. So that strips away the detector camera and just directly uses the camera. That's been done. We've tested it significantly. So again, if the transition happens smoothly, the device would look very different. But on the other hand, it would still have those sets of capabilities.
Yeah.
Other comments, questions from the lab?